I stand squarely behind my decision. After 20 years, I've learned the hard way that there was never a good time to withdraw U.S. forces. What's happening now could just as easily happen 5 years ago or 15 years in the future. We have to be honest. Our mission in Afghanistan is taking many missteps, made many missteps over the past 2 decades.
Welcome to CPAC Now, America Uncanceled. I'm Mercedes Schlapp, going solo today on this breaking news of what is happening in Afghanistan, chaos in Kabul. And joining us to break this all down, we have retired Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, chair of the Center for American Security at the American First Policy Institute, a former White House official and colleague, someone who I respect greatly and had worked for President Trump for quite some time. General Kellogg, thank you for joining us.
Hey, Mercy, thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Well, let's go right into this. You're seeing these images. You're watching the disaster in Afghanistan. What's your first reaction?
This was entirely predictable, and it was entirely preventable. And you're absolutely correct. It is a disaster of enormous consequences and proportions. This is something that is going to impact the United States foreign policy for decades to come, and the disaster that Biden created, frankly, on his own, because we actually had a pretty good plan on disengaging from Afghanistan, and he either put it in the shredder or threw it in the wastebasket. I don't know which, but it's on him.
Well, you bring up a good point, General, because I know that some in the liberal media are saying, well, you know, President Biden, he's only following Trump's plan. But what is the actual difference between what President Biden did in the swift withdrawal of our troops, leaving the Afghan forces very vulnerable, and what President Trump had proposed?
Yeah, and Mercy, it's a great comment, and it's a great question to ask. Look, good people can disagree, but President Trump made the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan after a 20-year war. And the reason we did that was it allowed us to intellectually pivot to the Pacific, to what we saw as the growing existential threat against the United States, which was China. But the only way you could do that was to get out of Afghanistan and get your thinking put in the right place. So over 18 months ago in February, we got together with our national security team, and we got a gentleman by the name of Mullah Baradar, who was the number 2 Taliban under Mullah Omar, the designated successor, out of a Pakistani jail. And we said, okay, to Amir Khan, the president did this. We need him to be our chief negotiator in support of us, what we want to do for the Taliban. Brought him into Doha. We brought in Zal Khalilzad, who was our special representative. And then we talked to Ghani. And we came up with a plan. And the plan was we would do a phased or deliberate withdrawal from Afghanistan, and we would have certain gates we would go through, or conditions. And as we went down the peace process and they met those conditions, we would withdraw forces. Here's the huge difference. The final condition that was to be met before we would withdraw troops was, the troop level we kept at under consultations with the Defense Department and the CIA, was 2,500 troops plus 3,000 paramilitary under the control of the CIA. But until we had intra-Afghan talks that were successful between President Ghani of Afghanistan and the Taliban to have a coalition, or for lack of a better term, a conditional government going forward, then we would not withdraw those troops. And Baradar understood that from the Taliban, and so did Ghani. And the reason I know that is because something Biden has not done. President Trump picked up the phone and personally called Mullah Baradar of the Taliban in Doha on 2 separate occasions and made it very clear to him what would happen if he did not follow through with his peace plan. As a result, from February of over a year ago, over 18 months, no American service member has been killed in Afghanistan by the Taliban. Didn't happen. But we had a very phased withdrawal. It was a deliberate withdrawal, and we had a plan to do it. They didn't follow through on it. They just said, we're going to get out, didn't put the conditions in place. And I know for a fact that Biden never picked up the phone and talked to Baradar. And I know that he talked to Ghani in the White House recently and did not lay down the law to Ghani like we did.
So you've been in so many of these basically national security meetings, in intelligence meetings. Do you think that President Biden is simply just not listening to the military?
Well, I think he had his mind set up. He was leaving Afghanistan, period, regardless of what was going to happen. And I think General Milley and at least I'm hoping Milley and Blinken and the rest of that crew told him, look, and Lloyd Austin as well, look, we have a set plan to get out of there. The plan is working. Let's just continue the plan. He said, no, we're leaving. And it was unconditional that he was going to do it. And the problem he never picked up the phone and called Berarder. Well, we all know about personal relationships. The reason we were able to talk with the Taliban is Berarder understood where Trump was coming from. He understood that, look, you mess around with the United States of America, you're going to pay a terrible price. And in those conversations, and I wish I understand how it was translated because I'm not sure, but I was in the Oval when it was said, and I think he got the message going forward. And Biden didn't do that, and he kind of left it open-ended. And then when the Taliban started winning, well, then it was game over, and they just rolled up the country.
Yeah, well, once the U.S. moved out, leaving the Afghan forces to fend for themselves, it definitely put the Afghan forces in such a horrible position. What an abandonment coming from the Biden administration. You tweeted out, just saying after 20 years, it comes to this: as Commander-in-Chief, Biden owns Afghan actions, but there are others who are accountable. You mentioned the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, NSA, DNI, Director of the CIA, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They own this too. And then you said resignations, ? Do you believe that we'll see some resignations coming after we have seen this horrific incident happen in Afghanistan, and making sure that someone in the Biden administration is held accountable?
Yeah, I do, Mercy. I think there are people who should leave. They should either resign or get fired, one of the two, or both that are out there. They own it as well. And if they don't do this and do the honorable thing of getting out of there, then it sends a very, very bad message. And here's the message it sends. You know, you can really screw up in epic proportions. You can mess up national security, which is hard enough as it is, and just kind of go on, well, we'll go on to the next one. The trouble is with the Biden administration, and I've seen this with immigration, what's happening there in border security, and now with Afghanistan, they're just like whistling past the graveyard. It's almost like, well, if we just don't talk about it, people will ignore it and just go on. And they're just, right. and that's where their policy seems to work. And I think that the military owns this, the Secretary of State owns it, Jake Sullivan as a national security owns it. They all own this, and for the American people, somebody should be held accountable. If nobody's held accountable, then I guess it's okay. It's not okay. They have damaged American national security for decades to come. You still remember Saigon? You're going to remember Kabul. You remember the helicopters in Saigon? You're going to remember that C-17 flying out of Kabul's airport, right, with people falling off that airplane.
Right. That is so right. And I believe it was one of our military officers who also you saw him take that American flag out of the embassy. Just so tragic. But I want to go into President Biden's speech that he gave yesterday from the White House after, of course, vacationing for quite some time at Camp David. Let me play a sound from the speech yesterday. Take a listen.
When I came into office, I inherited a deal that President Trump negotiated with the Taliban. Under his agreement, U.S. forces would be out of Afghanistan by May 1, 2021, just a little over 3 months after I took office. U.S. forces had already drawn down during the Trump administration from roughly 15,500 American forces to 2,500 troops in country. And the Taliban was at its strongest militarily since 2001. The choice I had to make as your president was either to follow through on that agreement or be prepared to go back to fighting the Taliban in the middle of the spring fighting season.
So, General, the president is saying, I stand squarely behind my decision. He's taking responsibility, yet putting blame on President Trump. tell us your thoughts of what your analysis is on this speech that he gave yesterday.
That was an incredibly disappointing speech. Everybody knows he wanted to get out of Afghanistan. That's not the issue he should have been talking about. He should have been talking how badly he executed it. He didn't talk about that. He said, well, I want to get out of Afghanistan. Noted. Well, this is, not our fight. Noted. Everything he's saying, I kind of got that. But he took no responsibility for the consequences of the action which he's taken out there going forward. And I think that was the most disappointing thing I heard. And I thought about it more this morning when I got up, and I listened to a speech again this morning. And I thought, this speech is worse than I remembered from yesterday, because the American people are going to look at this and go, so you've got a guy that's blaming everybody else out there, and he's your commander in chief. And oh, by the way, he didn't even take a single question after it. Nothing. And he owed that to the American people. He owed the American people for the press to ask him hard questions, and he was going to stand up in front of the American people and talk about it. He didn't bring in. Here's what we would have done differently. I really believe it was the Trump team. If President Trump had been at Camp David, that picture you see of President Biden by himself, you would have seen the entire national security team with him, because we would have worked together as a team. And it would have been really hard-knuckled, because I've been in those meetings where discussions are held. They're hard discussions, but it would have been a group effort coming out of there. And then we would have come back to the White House with the president as a team and made those and stood behind him when it was made. He stood out there by himself. Those were his words. I don't know if those were his team's words, but if they were his team's words, we should go back a little bit, as I said a minute ago, and just fire everybody or get their resignations. So I was just tremendously disappointed that this is the president of the United States. I think what he forgets is those words just weren't to the American people. Those words went to the world. The entire world was listening. American men and women in uniform were listening to those words. And he failed them yesterday.
Right. And you know what really struck me was the fact that President Biden almost blamed the Afghan forces for not being able to take on the Taliban by themselves. This is after we've invested tens of billions of dollars in Afghanistan to ensure that the Afghan people were safe, to ensure that Afghan women and children could really, have the freedoms that they need. Afghan girls being able to go back to school, Afghan women going to work. We were making progress there. It was actually as pretty stable as we can see it. All of that thrown away in one day. I just really was stunned by President Biden's criticism of the Afghan forces. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's a couple thoughts on that. One is over 50,000 Afghan soldiers have died in combat. Others have been maimed and wounded going forward. And it's really hard to blame the other military. Part of that blame, I think, is on ourselves. And what I mean by that is we need to ask the military some really hard questions. For the last 18 years, and the reason I say 18, not 20, because I think the first 2 years were righteous, and then we went to routine. We went after al-Qaeda. We went after bin Laden. We went after Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who sits in a Guantanamo jail. Those were right things to do. But the last 18 years, what were we doing? We were trying to create a military that looks like us instead of should have looked like Afghanistan. So those are the questions that need to be asked, and I think they're hard questions. But how do you blame the Afghan military and the government for falling when the president of Afghanistan leaves in the middle of the night, doesn't tell anybody, gets on a jet and flies? What are you ever going to ask him to do?
Right. Well, but obviously they were put in a horrific position. I mean, the United States, as you mentioned earlier, we hadn't lost a single life in Afghanistan for a bit of time. We've also seen that we were there to provide support and intelligence. Now it's a free-for-all. We know the Taliban is going to gain access to sensitive information and equipment. Will we see, as the Pentagon said, more terrorist threats due to this fall of the Afghan government and being overrun by the Talibans?
Yeah, here's what I think is going to happen. When you talk about the threats out there, I'm turning around just a bit. You're going to see the threats come out because they don't believe the Americans have the will to fight back. And they look to the President of the United States, and they do take a key off who the leaders are, that they don't think they're going to be at risk at all going forward. So that's where the threats are going to come from. Not the physical threats, say, of Afghanistan, but it's going to be, well, this guy's not going to react to it. And why this is important is when you think back on how Trump handled it, we killed Soleimani, we killed Baghdadi, we finished the ISIS caliphate. They knew that Trump meant business. Right now, I don't think the world can look at Biden and say, I think he means business out there. And because of that, weakness allows things to happen. So weakness creates the weakness that you're going to see in the United States. So I think that threat is going to come from that concern about American weakness going forward.
So are you concerned that Twitter, for example, allows the Taliban spokesperson to share their horrific propaganda on social media while they still suspend President Trump's Twitter account?
Look, Mercedes, I'm stunned by that. I mean, it's amazing to me that we let that happen out there. You let somebody like that get on social media, and then you don't let the President of the United States on social media. You may not like what he says. There's a lot of people I don't like what they say. But that's one thing great about the United States of America. We've got freedom of speech, and we should allow it to happen. And cutting that out is incredible. And then allowing him to have free reign with propaganda, it's just, I think stunning is an understatement.
Yeah. And also, what you realize is we're all for freedom of speech. What we're not for is for the recruitment of terrorism and terrorists to go and support the Taliban and their efforts in sheltering, not at the time, Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda terrorists as well. Let's just end with one quick question here in terms of what this means. As we know, Afghanistan and Iran, they're right next to each other. What does this mean for how this emboldened countries like Iran, countries like China and Russia that are also basically saying that the Taliban government is the legitimate government of Afghanistan?
Yeah, I think they see weakness, and they'll pretty well move on that weakness of the President of the United States, which is unfortunate, but it's going to happen out there. Look, you said that about China. I would tell China, yeah, go ahead, recognize the Taliban. That's fine with me. We're going to recognize Taiwan. You want to play that game? We'll play that game. And I remember being with President Trump, and he was hardball about that. He would play really tough games, and it's not games with a little g, but he knew how to play national security. I have no confidence that Biden will do that. So what he's created a tremendous gap and tremendous weakness.
That's a great point. And I just read a report that China is obviously moving towards with ships to Taiwan. This can only get into more of a complicated situation at the international level. General Kellogg, thank you so much for joining CPAC Now. I really appreciate your insight.
Thanks, Mercy. Appreciate it.
Stay with us. We'll be right back. CPAC Now, America Uncanceled. I'm Mercedes Schlapp. We are tracking the latest in Afghanistan. I got to tell you, those images are heart-wrenching. I even read one of these stories where the first female mayor in Afghanistan, she literally said, quote, "I'm waiting for them to come to my house to kill me." It is such a tragedy what we've seen, such incompetence coming from President Biden and his team. And he has yet to answer questions from the press. This is what I would call one of the most catastrophic moments for the Biden presidency. And of course, I want to take you to some of the tweets that my husband, Matt Schlapp, and I have been sending out. And remember, you can follow Matt Schlapp at @mschlapp. And let's just share the first one. Presidents make mistakes. Few ever publicly admit them. I get Biden's desire to put a gloss on this disaster of his making, but he can either choose to be stubborn or try to fix what can be fixed. He's choosing to say he is right over showing leadership. That won't be rewarded. I got to tell you, I've been watching the social media action. There are so many people out there that are so upset about what we are seeing in Afghanistan. We're actually having people holding on to the wheels of a plane, of an Air Force plane, and then falling and dying. And it is completely tragic. We'll see more of these public executions, and they really are going to be going after the Christians there and the religious minorities. It's something that all I can say is just pray. And quite frankly, I don't think President Biden knows how to fix it. He's really, really backtracked and put even our troops and our American allies in harm's way. Next tweet from Matt Schlapp. How many Americans will die because convicted jihadists were released from Afghani prisons yesterday by the Taliban? How many Christians and Jews and gays will be executed with weapons? U.S. tax dollars paid for. This is not just about a bad week. This bungled exit has unleashed hell. And that is so sad. I really feel so strongly for the Afghan women and those girls. They've had a taste of freedom. Many of these girls have had education for the first time in their lives. This is something that actually we should all be supporting. And we have to quite remember that the U.S. was at a position where we were looking to withdraw. But of course, because of President Biden's refusal to listen to the military and to the intelligence and take an ideological position instead, really has created a huge disaster in Afghanistan. Last tweet from Matt Schlapp. Actually, this epic military disaster of a pullout in Afghanistan will guarantee that the U.S. will continue to be mired in Afghanistan, unfortunately. And that is the truth. The big question that we have is, what will Joe Biden do next? Obviously, he had no plan several days ago. He had mentioned back in July that it was highly unlikely that the Taliban would overrun the country. Well, obviously, Joe Biden was wrong, and it has only put the United States in a weakened position, and we do not know how we're going to get out of this mess that Joe Biden has created. And to finish off, I just wanted to share one of my tweets. I know mine are not as exciting as Matt Schlapp's because he wildly can entertain all of us, to say the least. Is we saw that in a USA Today article that President George W. Bush, former President George W. Bush, basically came out and did not criticize Joe Biden for his actions. And I shared with the social media audience, so disappointing that former President Bush did not criticize President Biden's catastrophic decision to withdraw from Afghanistan. Biden just destroyed Bush's legacy on stopping the Taliban and helping Afghan women and girls have more freedom. This was something that George W. Bush ran on, the end of terrorism, making sure that we would stop terrorists from attacking the United States and important areas across the globe. And what does our former president do? He says nothing. He doesn't do anything to be tough against Joe Biden. Joe Biden just destroyed the legacy of George W. Bush, because now what we're seeing will be Taliban women and girls who will be oppressed, who will be forced into marriage, who will be sex slaves, who will no longer have the freedoms they once enjoyed because of the help of the United States and the Afghan government. So I got to tell you this. I've been in politics for a very long time. This is the worst that I've seen coming out of a presidency. It shows how weak we are to the world. It shows how bad these decisions are being made by President Biden with no explanation whatsoever, or sharing and saying that we got to put the blame on President Trump. The responsibility lies with President Biden, and as he said, the buck stops with me. So we'll be watching, we'll keep reporting, we'll keep telling you what we can do to stop President Biden from the continuous disasters that we're seeing, not only in Afghanistan, but even at our borders, which we know is a humanitarian crisis and a national security crisis as well. So thanks so much for joining us. I want to toss it over to our ACU board member, national security expert, someone who we respect greatly. She has a great analysis on what is happening in Afghanistan. Let's play that.
The war in Afghanistan has been 20 years in the making. Victory was never going to be achieved. And for that, I blame a lot of people, the intelligence community for failing to see it. I blame the political leaders, Democrats, and even some Republicans who kept trying to build a nation out of the most illiterate, corrupt, incompetent country in the world. And I also particularly blame the Biden administration. They knew this was coming. They knew the United States would have to leave. They knew we would have to evacuate, and they had no plan. So now what are we going to see? Tens of thousands of friendly Afghans who helped us are now going to have their lives destroyed. Thousands of Americans are going to be evacuated, hopefully and safely. But I think what we're going to see is, sadly, assassinations. I think we'll see kidnappings. I think we'll see hostage taking. And we have 5,000 American combat troops in Afghanistan without a plan.